Okay, firstly, some props. You all have them in your pocket. So I don't know. In fact, you probably all have at least two. Maybe I have four bank cards. And let's think about them analytically a little bit first before we start, from a privacy perspective. Look at this. What do you think I reveal about myself by using this card at the point of sale? Well, on the front, there's printed Visa debit, so I've revealed my payment system. And that's quite a reasonable thing to do, because if there's security involved, you need some kind of certificate authority, and therefore there needs to be some public key you look up to check that this was really issued by Visa. Okay, so we can't avoid that. It's okay to print that on the front. I also give away my bank. That's not ideal, but at the same time, they're quite possibly it's difficult to avoid that, but still you could possibly hide that information. It's not even necessary to reveal this. And there's an improvement here is that at least they don't print my numbers on the front of the car, so when I wave it around, you can't tell what my personal identified number is. I'm not being personally identified, but there's some kind of weak identity going out, which is basically the payment system I use and the bank that I use. Yes, you would agree with that. And then you can reasonably assume, because there's some public key involved, what they've done is they've encrypted all the communications between the card and the terminal, because we've known how to do cryptography for a good number of years, decades even, and therefore no further personal information is revealed. Would you agree with that statement? There goes someone from Birmingham who's smiling because he saw the talk a couple of weeks ago. Yes, and of course that is really very far from the truth indeed. So firstly, a little bit how it works. As I said, what happens is when you're manufacturing a card, there's a payment system who will issue the card, not the bank. And together with the bank, they will put some information for communicating with the bank, a share key with the bank, and a certificate from the payment authority, and that will be embedded into the card. Okay, this is part of the trust mechanism. And what happens is you engage in a protocol, which is called the EMV protocol, which is the Europay Visa MasterCard protocol, between the card and the terminal. This is a protocol which we're mainly going to focus on. I notice it's in clear text mainly. Okay, so they haven't encrypted almost anything. And in fact, everything is given away, including your bank account number, the amount of the transaction, and so on. So you already start to see a problem for privacy. But at the end, the application cryptogram is created. That is then sent to the bank of the merchant directly, and then they use some routing information to send that information via the payment system itself, the backbone network, to the bank of the cardholder, where they will confirm the transaction. Okay, so they will exchange having the cryptogram as proof that this payment was made, and therefore the bank of the cardholder will debit the bank of the terminal. Did I get that the right way around? Never mind. This is a basic setup of the protocol. And there's a few things. As I said, it's already in plain text, but there's a few real alarm signs when you start to look at the protocol. This is the communication between the card and the terminal. The first bit is okay. This is basically selecting the payment system. So it basically says, am I selecting Visa debit? It's okay to put that in plain text. We agreed. That's fine to have that. But already you get a bit of an alarm when you have this processing options description object list, I think it is, the PDOL. And that basically tells basically the terminal what protocol to use from that point onwards. And playing with that list allows you to get a mismatch between the terminal and the card. And therefore, the card skips certain messages and the terminal expects different messages. And there are all sorts of PIN bypass attacks that emerge from just manipulating that piece of plain text. So that's a security concern. That's not my contribution. But it's well known that you can manipulate that in all sorts of ways in most cards and basically bypass PINs and make high value payments. So already you're alarmed. And but there's some other stuff here. There's the PAN. This is basically the account number. Expiry date. Expiry date is also a form of weak identity because I can, with high probability, distinguish two people. And this application transaction counter, this is another thing which potentially could be used because there's a high likelihood the application transaction counter, if it's close to the one you've recently seen, probably it's the same person again. And if it's miles off, there's probably a different person. So you can see there's quite a lot of information here that can be used to track people. Already you've got the PAN. This is unique to the individual, so it's already bad. But there's even if you manage to hide this in some clever way, you're still giving away some information. So what we have to do when we're analyzing privacy is we have to think about the threats. What is the threat that we're facing here? So we build a profile of a kind of an attacker, which is going to be able to interact with the system and maybe try and obtain someone's privacy or private information to identify them or track them. We consider a number of profiles, and this is where we start to get towards the theory, which I'll go towards at the end of the talk. Is that we set this up as basically a biosimulation problem. But how to set up the biosimulation problem depends on what kind of threat you're trying to counter. So there's a first threat that we want to consider. It's the threat of passive eavesdroppers. What they do is they sit within 20 meters of you, listen to all the communications, wireless communications, just intercept messages, and already they're getting enough information to track you, yes? But there are other threats. For instance, an active attacker can say, I'm not going to wait until you make a transaction, but I'm actually going to go up to you in the street and I'm going to trigger the card because I can actually, the cards are passive. They will engage in a session with anyone. And basically you can then obtain the PAN and you don't send any information to the bank, you just stop and you have enough information to basically identify the individual at will on the street based on this information. So there's this active attacker threat. And in addition, there's all sorts of legal privacy issues, like, for instance, data minimization. So the merchant is getting all sorts of information along the way, not just the attackers potentially on the outside, but people involved in the network are getting all sorts of information that they shouldn't really have. So there's some very clear things we want to address here. So basically, these are our two threats. So as a passive attacker, you can do this at 20 meters, but as an active attacker, you need to be a bit closer, maybe 1 meter, in order to be able to power up the card. So what happened? Well, this is an obvious problem, you'd think, so you think they've sorted it. Visa don't care, because what they do is they just take out insurance against any issues. But that doesn't protect your privacy. That just protects them against the consequences of the security problems, which are different from the privacy problems. MasterCard are taking things a bit more seriously. So they put out an RFC in 2012 for a new protocol. And basically you run a key agreement protocol at the top, and then you're supposed to run the protocol and everything's encrypted. And then already the situation is improved. Because all that information that was in plain text before is not so easy to obtain. You can only get it if you are an active attacker. You go up to the card and you actually pretend to be a protocol, but you engage in the Diffie-Hellman handshake at the beginning. Okay, so this is good. This is kernel 8, but it was only released in June 2023. Okay, and it does not take into account neither the threat of an active attacker who is actually involved in powering up a card and starting communications. And it does not address data minimization in any way whatsoever. Okay, so we still have quite some way to go. And this is where the work that I want to convey is fitting in. So this is our contribution. Back in 2022, so of course, this is before this new EMV protocol has been released by MasterCard, which I'm not sure is even deployed in any cars, by the way, yet. We did an analysis of their RFC, and we found that indeed the protocol that they're presenting is good against passive attackers. That was proven previously, but these active attackers are not taken fully into account. And then going forwards, we said, well, that's just looking at the RFC, which just concerned this very first part of the protocol, this key agreement at the beginning. What happens to the rest of the protocol? And of course, the situation is much more complex at that point. So this is the basic timeline going on of what I've described so far. RFC from MasterCard was in 2012. There was this paper published by, this is an old school friend of mine from Kelso, that's where it was brought up. So been away for 22 years, by the way. But he was also working in this topic in his PhD back in the 2014, and he gave the passive attacker model. Later on, we gave this active attacker model of the same protocol and showed that it doesn't satisfy privacy in any way. And this is based on bisimulation, which I'll get to in a bit. Only recently, this kernel has been released, and since my student in Luxembourg, who was funded by FNR, hence the logos at the front page, he submitted his PhD thesis, which presented an improvement over this protocol, which protects against all these threats that I've been discussing, not just one of them. Okay. More recently still, just they've released a new version. Already this one was flawed in some way, I don't know what. It's imperceptible to me, the difference. More recently still, next week we'll present this protocol as CCS. So this is a bit of a warm-up for that occasion. So how did we design our protocol? If we want to design a protocol that is going to protect someone's privacy, we need a set of requirements. Just incrementally improving the protocol isn't going to help. You need to really design a new protocol. So firstly, it needs to respect the usability requirements. It needs to be fast. So you need to use the crypto, which is on your cards already. Basically, elliptic curve cryptography is well handled already by dedicated circuits. We need to be able to enter a PIN. We need to satisfy certain kind of modes. So you need to be able to make offline payments, online payments. Offline payments are when the terminal can't contact the bank at that particular moment, and they just take the cryptogram from you directly. Online is when the bank is contacted directly. We need contactless, and we also need high value and low value. So we want to support all of these modes which are currently supported by EMV. We want to satisfy some security requirements, which is basically authentication. So the terminal, once it's finished, it really has authenticated the card really did run the protocol, and all the certificates are correct. And similarly, when the bank has got to the end of the session, it knows that there really was a session involving the terminal and the card out there. They did follow the protocol. And everyone agreed on all of the elements of the transaction. But then we have this privacy requirement, and the way we're going to succinctly capture all of these requirements together is we're going to verify a formal privacy property called unlinkability. So unlinkability is the ability to basically hold a card, walk around and still use it, and still nobody is going to be able to track one usage of the card to another usage of the card. So it's as if you've destroyed the card between each usage and minted a new card and you've used it again. So people cannot track you individually. This is one of the strongest privacy properties you can expect. It's stronger than anonymity because, of course, if you give away your identity during a protocol, then you can be tracked. So this is a really very strong property to have. So the protocol works as follows. What we do is we engage in a Diffie-Hellman handshake at the beginning using a public key of the card, which is this C to the power of G. There's a notation for C to the power of G. And then we generate a fresh blinding factor A. This is basically MasterCard's proposal. So we're building a MasterCard at this point. And we multiply our blinding factor by this fresh element. And this means each time I present my key, it looks different. Later on, I will present a certificate. So I'm skipping to this point. And the certificate is on this public key of the card. But what I do is I use a homomorphic encryption scheme, such as a Verhulst signatures. And basically, I multiply the certificate by A, the blinding factor, as well as the actual key material that I had previously. And this way, each time I present a certificate proving that this card really was issued by the bank or by the payment system, then it will look different, and therefore you're not trackable. So this was the essence of the RFC inside the original proposal by MasterCard. Although I'm pausing there because, in fact, they got that a little bit wrong, because what they did is they blinded the key material, but they forgot to blind the certificate. Therefore, you could still use the certificate to track people. So that was our first improvement, which I mentioned earlier from a few years ago. But this protocol, you can see, has a few more messages involved. One of the reasons is because we want to hide information such as the expiry date, because that already gives away information. So the way to do this is you say, what month do you want to the card? And you come back with not just any old certificate, but a certificate that proves that you were valid in that month. And this doesn't give away like your actual expiry date. It just says you're valid now. You see the difference there. So you're revealing less information. Some transactions going on. Then to complete the transaction, I think I'll skip over that for just now, just in the interest of time, because I want to talk a little bit about how we set this up formally. This is of interest maybe to the programming language community, because what we do is we basically model the system as it should behave. Ideally, if unlinkability hold, that is, you cannot really, there's only one card, one usage of a card in the system, and we set up the also a model where the cards can actually be used many times, which is how it's really used. And if you know the Pi calculus, this bang here, this exclamation mark, is a replication which says I have many copies of something. Okay, so I'm saying I have many copies of a session which uses the same basically key material. Okay, which means that the same user is using the card over and over again. Okay, and inside here, I have the same thing, which is a usage of a card with a particular configuration. It is not replicated, so it's only used once. You see the difference there? That's the only difference in all of this this big slide. The other thing is like how the bank works, how the terminal works, etc., how we set up the certificates. Okay, I change only one character, this one here. Okay, and if I cannot tell the difference between these two systems, if they are equivalent, then I know that it must be unlinkable, because this one was certainly unlinkable because there was only one card, one uses of a card. So I really can't tell the difference between these by any way that the attacker can interact with the system, given these active capabilities. Remember at the beginning, I said the threat model is important. So we're accounting for this active attacker there. Basically, this is the Dolovyal model we're using, if people know this from the security literature. Okay, so that's nice. We can prove this. We can also do it for like some more sophisticated setups of this, like because there's not just one question we can ask, so there's a few variants of this. But what I'd like to do now is just in the last 5 minutes is to maybe give you a little taste of how it works under the hood, this methodology we're applying. So what you do, as I said, is you're trying to show them these two things are equivalent. I was vague about what I meant by equivalent. I'm going to be a little bit more precise first, before being really precise. What I mean by equivalent is that we want to show that they are bisimilar. And what we do to prove a bisimilarity, the two things are related by bisimilarity, is we construct a relation, which is a bisimulation, which is closed under a certain number of properties, which are basically all the things like sending outputs, receiving inputs from the environment, and doing all sorts of games with these actions which an attacker would perform. So what you do is you build a big relation, and this is where the hard work goes. You have to really do this manually. And then relatively easy is what you can do is you can check that this big relation you've built is in fact a bisimulation. It's a bit laborious, but it's just routine. You just go through and check every transition. Okay. But what we can do is we can, you can see like that's a task where you really need a PhD student who's really dedicated. You can't just do it overnight. What we might want to do is we might want to reduce the complexity of the problem. So if I take just the handshake at the beginning that I was talking about from the original RFC that we were analyzing, it just looks like this. So remember, we had this blinding factor A being generated, and then this signature being presented, which is blinded also by the same blinding factor. So that this parameter here is the first part of the Diffie-Hellman handshake. And the signature is going to be a signature over A times C to G times G, okay? Because this is going to be a homomorphic signature scheme, okay? And therefore, these two things are going to be check out when we want to actually check the signature. And furthermore, this is the signature of the payment system. This is the basic protocol here. So we can actually reduce this to a very simple problem indeed. Notice how simple this is. I've stripped everything away, the terminal, the bank, everything. And we just have the bits which are active in that part of the protocol. And since we're only using a public signature, there was no shared key material, so we can actually strip all this information away and just verify this tiny part of the system where we have only a card which is active. And we're doing the same trick again. We have the exclamation mark here. We don't have the exclamation mark here. And we've thrown away much of the problem. So what we're using here is something a little bit more sophisticated than just any old biosimulation. We're using a bisimilarity congruence, which is one that is preserved in any context. So we have a bit of compositionality coming in, okay? And indeed, because we have this property, we know that it will hold when we bring in the terminal, for instance. If we bring in a terminal process, we get this for free. Notice in the previous one, there was no terminal in the picture. Without any work, just an immediate consequence of this being a biosimulation congruence, we can say, well, it will hold in with respect to a particular terminal. And that's by just plugging the previous two processes both into the same context over here. So there's a nice little nugget of theory there, is we can make use of bisimilarity congruences to really save lots and lots of work when we're doing problems which involve like huge bisimulations in the real world. Okay. Just a little summary. This is more now a conclusion. But just to give you a taste of what that means when I say bisimilarity congruence, people who know bisimulation will appreciate the first bit already. What you do is, if you can perform an action, this pi here is input or output action, an action of the attacker basically, then on the other side, you can do a matching transaction. I think that's understandable. So there's a game here. If someone plays a game and you want to say it's equivalent, then the other person has to play the same move, a move which has the same effect, okay? And furthermore, you stay inside the relation so you can keep on playing, okay? That's the essence of bisimilarity. And in the pi calculus, we need to take into account certain like kind of extra stuff like to do with the knowledge of the attacker. That's normal for security. And the additional thing you get with the quasi-open bisimilarity is you're closed under basically reachability. So basically you close under all possible substitutions and extra knowledge you can infer from the environment. So you're upwards closed when you are considering this relation. Basically, what does this mean? It means if someone comes along and says, this is a variable and we don't know enough about it, it's an open variable, we can say, well, here's some more information about that variable. Now can you prove it? And if you can also win that game, then you know these two things are equivalent. And that's the extra element that is involved. So this is quasi-open bisimilarity applied to privacy checking for payment protocols. Okay, and furthermore, this quasi-open bisimilarity is pretty optimal in the sense that there's not a unique notion because you can do non-interleaving versions of it, etc. But either it's at the optimal point in the spectrum of possible equivalences you can use to analyze this problem because it is a congruence and it is suitable for proving privacy properties in a very precise sense, which I can maybe discuss further. Okay. Yeah.
One of the properties you mentioned required was fast. How do you square that with the homomorphic encryption you look at? And can you test that in your verify that in one thing?
Yeah, I have to warn people, my hearing is not 100%. Maybe I'll put up close to you. Yes. That's on now. It's okay, I've got to say, I just thought this was not working.
One of the properties you mentioned needed to be maintained was fast operation. How do you square that with the homomorphic encryption used in the middle of your stuff?
So this is part of the reason why this protocol was a little bit more difficult than you'd expect to come up with. It wasn't so obvious because we had this big constraint: you have to respect the resources of the card. And if you didn't have to respect the resources of the card and the timing, then you could use a kind of one solution kills all approach, which is basically zero knowledge proofs. And you just stick them on the card, and of course you can get this functionality. But because of those constraints, we had to be more careful in designing the protocol. Is that roughly what you're asking?
I'm under the impression that homomorphic encryption is generally quite slow and big, and
so these Verhoeven themes have been tested on the
maintain
cards.
That property?
Because
were you able to test that with your model kind of thing, or some simulation type things?
Yes, this is where we need security experts like yourself to come in and build a prototype and show it really works at that level. Okay.
Another question over there. So I'm assuming that in order to prove bisimilarity, you need some hardness assumption. Like for example, discrete log is hard. So how do you model this kind of hardness assumption in your proof?
Yes. So this is a classic thing because basically we're doing Doliv-Yau, and it's basically treats cryptography a bit as a black box. So we just assume that when you're using a hash, for instance, you can't reverse it. And someone else has designed an amazing scheme out there which you can plug in for H, which will satisfy that requirement. And so we're looking rather than at the scheme which cryptographers would look at and the probability of being able to attack a scheme. What we're looking at is, well, how do you use those schemes in context inside the protocol? How can attackers interact with those that particular combination of schemes which make up the protocol, and then seeing whether there's attacks. So we're asking a different question from that. We just assumed cryptographers did their work for each of the individual components. Yeah.
So you mentioned that the standard protocol has an offline mode.
Yes.
Do people actually use that? I'm just recalling sort of struggling with someone failing to get a connection for sort of 10 minutes. And
yeah, it happened to me like on Saturday, and then it happened on Thursday last week. And yes, and each time, because this is one of the arguments discussions I had in Birmingham when I was across. How much do cars actually use it? A lot of British cars don't even support it. My Luxembourg car does. So it varies, but then there's a good argument for why you would want it in general globally to support it as a protocol. Because if it's failing in central Glasgow, frequently terminals due to congestion, what's it going to do in, I don't know, rural Ethiopia, and you're wanting to do this? Okay, you know what I mean? So I think we do want, for resilience purposes, that's almost another requirement. We do want to have support for offline transactions, and we want to know it's secure. And we want offline transactions to build in checks like whether the card is actually valid and issued properly, so they can do it locally.